Preface and Introduction of With the American Ambulance Field Service in France, Personal Letters of a Driver at the Front. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Wales. With the American Ambulance Field Service in France, Personal Letters of a Driver at the Front by Leslie Buswell. Preface. These letters, according to ordinary ethics in such matters, should not, perhaps, be published. They were merely intended as tributes of friendship and remembrance, casually written, in pencil often, at moments between duties, with no thought of their being destined to any further purpose than that distance and absence might count a little less through the pictures they would give of a day's work far away. Excepting that here and there in each letter a few details, quite personal, have been omitted, and of course the names of places sometimes changed, they are untouched. Their author has had no chance to revise them, nor, it must be confessed, has his consent to their printing been asked. Knowing him, there seemed little likelihood of his believing them worthy of special attention, not at least without a correspondence of persuasion and much loss of time. Only the exigency of the hour and a conviction of their worth have led me to take this step. If they give to those who may now read as clear a vision as they have given me of the chivalrous work our young American volunteers are doing in France, they will have achieved something. If occasionally some reader, grateful for this proof that our country is contributing so worthy a part to the heroism of today, should feel inspired to do what he is able toward the encouragement and continuation of this work, these letters will have served a high purpose. The knowledge that a possibility so worth while would ultimately outweigh with my friend any personal consideration is justification of the liberty taken, and of this book. Perhaps for the time and effort the writer of these records so generously spent for friendship's sake in the midst of hard and hazardous days, he may find recompense in the realization that aside from the pleasure which their coming meant to one who looked for them, they may bring much benefit to the service he so valiantly describes, and through that service to thousands of men and women whose happiness death might otherwise have destroyed. H.D.S. Introduction. For many years before the war there existed at Neuilly-sur-Seine, a suburb of Paris, a semi-philanthropic institution supported by Americans and known as the American Hospital. At the outbreak of the war, this institution instantly and naturally became the rallying point for Americans who loved France and wanted to help care for her wounded soldiers. Within a few weeks it was evident, however, that larger quarters must be found. A splendid new school building, which was rapidly nearing completion in the neighborhood, was rented. Its large, well-lighted and well-ventilated rooms were transformed into hospital wards, operating rooms, dormitories, and offices. A multitude of doctors, surgeons, and nurses were brought over from the United States, and thus the American Ambulance Hospital in the Lycée Pasteur, with accommodations for more than 600 wounded soldiers, came into being. Soon the generosity of another American friend of France made possible a second American Ambulance Hospital, and the venerable College of Juilly, located about 30 miles east of Paris, was steam-fitted, electric-lighted, and plumbed, and made over into a hospital for about 200 additional wounded, with distinguished American surgeons in charge. From the outset it was clear that the saving of soldiers' lives depended quite as much upon the quick transportation of the wounded as upon their surgical treatment, and in September 1914, when the battlefront surged close to Paris, a dozen automobiles given by Americans, hastily extemporized into ambulances and driven by American volunteers, ran back and forth night and day between the western end of the Marne Valley and Paris. This was the beginning of the American Ambulance Field Service, with which the following letters have to do. During the autumn and winter that followed, many more cars were given and many more young Americans volunteered, and when the battle front retired from the vicinity of Paris, sections of motor ambulances were detached from the hospitals at Neuilly and Juilly and became more or less independent units attached to the several French armies, serving the dressing stations and army hospitals within the army zone. Today, more than 100 such ambulances, given and driven by American friends of France, are carrying wounded French soldiers along the very fighting front in Belgium and France. In Belgium and northern France, where the American Ambulance Field Service has had an important section since the early months of the war, the valiant service rendered during the Second Battle of the Yser and during the many bombardments from long-range guns in and about Dunkirk has attracted official recognition from the highest officers in the Army. At the time of the prolonged battles in the vicinity of Ypres in May, General Putz wrote that the American section had, by working 5 nights and days without interruption, assured the evacuation of the hospitals in Everdinghe, though under continual shell fire, which covered all of the roads in the neighborhood and even the hospitals themselves. "I cannot praise too highly," he added, "the courage and devotion of which the men in your section have given evidence, and I ask you to transmit to them my congratulations and my thanks for the great physical effort which they have so generously made and the signal services which they have rendered." In the section of Alsace, which France has definitely recovered from Germany, the American Ambulance Field Service has now the only automobile ambulances, and they are performing a service which no other automobile ambulances could perform. Because of the lightness and power of our little cars, and because we are willing to use them up in this service and replace them without restrictions, our ambulances are running over steep mountain passes in Alsace, where the French automobile ambulances are unable to cross, and over which wounded soldiers were formerly carried on muleback. They have been able to reduce the duration of the journey of the wounded between the dressing stations and the hospitals from 4 or 5 hours to less than 1, at the same time substituting transport in a comfortable springed vehicle for the agony of transport in the mule litters. 2 of the men in this section have already received the Croix de Guerre for special acts of valor. We have another section of ambulances attached to an American Army field hospital of 30 tents, which is also a branch of the American Ambulance Hospital made available to the French Army by generous American friends. This movable hospital is equipped to care for 140 wounded, and the whole installation of ward tents, officers' and nurses' tents, operating tents, mess tents, etc., can be mounted by our men or demounted and packed on motor trucks ready for transportation in less than 3 hours. It is destined to be of great service in the devastated regions when the French Army begins its advance. Finally, we have a section of ambulances in Lorraine, to which has been entrusted exclusively the service of carrying the wounded in the much fought-over region around Bois-le-Pretre. This section alone has carried, on the average, about 7,500 wounded per month. The men work continually within range of the German shells, and are almost daily under German fire. The section as a whole, and their leader, have received honorable mention in official dispatches, and have been given the Croix de Guerre. The daily life and activities of the men of this section are sketched by one of its members in the following personal letters, which, while written without any thought of publication, are now privately printed in order that those generous Americans on the other side of the Atlantic, who are making this chivalrous work possible, may more truly appreciate its value and efficiency. From this unconscious story one gets an impression of the devoted service which young Americans are rendering in France, and of the way in which they are reducing the agony and saving the lives of wounded French soldiers. One sees, too, how deeply this service is appreciated, and how, through it, the old friendship which has existed between France and the United States since the very beginning of our national history is being quickened and rejuvenated. Happy are all free peoples too strong to be dispossessed, but blessed are those among nations who dare to be strong for the rest. A.P.A. September 6, 1915. End of Preface and Introduction. Part 1 of With the American Ambulance Field Service in France, Personal Letters of a Driver at the Front, by Leslie Buswell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. With the American Ambulance Field Service in France, American Ambulance, June 17th. I came here, Pont-à-Mousson, last night after a 7 hours' journey to Nancy from Paris. On the way I found much to interest me, as, if you will look on your map, you will see that the railway runs beside the river Marne, then the Meuse, and lastly the Moselle. An officer pointed out to me all the interesting places where the Germans advanced and then retreated in a hurry, or practically a rout, leaving everything behind, even to their flags, which I believe are now in London. After passing these and nearing Nancy, I saw what looked like a fleet of aeroplanes, and the officer explained to me that it was a flying Taube being shot at by the French. It looked like this. Diagram follows. I am told that they rarely hit one. On arriving at Nancy, I was met by Salisbury, our section leader, and after a very good meal in the most beautiful little town you could hope to see, and where the Kaiser and 10,000 troops in dress parade were waiting on a hill close by to enter in state last October, we started by motor for Pont-à-Mousson. Some 15 kilometers further on, our lights were put out, and we then entered the region under shell fire. It was a funny feeling, listening to my conductor talking about how this shell and that shell hit here and there, and all along the route we passed torn-up trees, houses, and roads. At last we came to Pont-à-Mousson, a dear little village with about 8,000 inhabitants, and felt our way, so to speak, in the darkness and silence to the barracks which are now the headquarters of the ambulance. I found that there were about 20 cars and 22 men here, the latter all enthusiastic about their work and the help the section were giving the French. The day before I arrived, a shell hit the house next door, and on first sight one would think it was the barracks itself which had been hit. These huge, high-explosive shells are sent into the town every 2 or 3 days, and everywhere one sees masses of brick and stone, all that remains of houses struck. The Germans have bombarded the town over 110 times. After being introduced to the boys, I went to my room, which is some 160 meters up the road, nearer the trenches, but safer for all that. Here I found I was to share the house with another man, Schroeder by name, a Hollander and a very nice fellow, who has already lost one brother and has had another wounded in the French army. My bedroom is a quite typical French peasant room, very comfortable, and I felt grateful to know that I was to have a bed and not straw to sleep on. I went to sleep there my first night in comparative quietness, only hearing now and then a crack of a musket, which in peace time one would think was merely a backfire of some motor. In the morning I woke at 6 and went to breakfast in our barracks, which is always served at 7 o'clock. Walking out of my front door, I came into the main street. To the left is the way to the town and the barracks. To the right, the road goes straight on, an avenue of trees. My friend, or housemate, pointed out, about 500 meters away, what looked like a fallen tree across the road. Imagine my feelings when he told me that they were the French trenches. To the right and left of this avenue are hills, and on the left runs the river Moselle. On the ridge of hills on the right one sees a brown line. These are the German trenches, and walking down the road to breakfast one gets the knowledge that a first-class rifle shot could pick one off. After breakfast I was asked by one of the men, Roeder, if I would like to look about the place, and I jumped at the invitation. We got into a Ford ambulance. No one can realize the excellence of the Ford for this purpose until he has seen what they can do. And we started on a tour, or petite promenade, as an officer told us we were doing. Pont-à-Mousson was in the hands of the Germans for 5 days, and our headquarters were the German officers' headquarters. The French partially blew up the bridge which crosses the Moselle at this most picturesque point, and for the last 5 days the Germans have been bombarding it, attempting in their turn to destroy it. Many of the houses round it seem to have been hit, and the 2 places where shells have taken most effect are on the bridge the French have repaired with wood. The boys tell me it is a wonderful sight to see the water rising like a geyser when the shells hit the river. To show how careless the few remaining peasants are, directly the Germans have apparently ceased firing, they get into boats to pick up the fish killed in hundreds by the concussion. We left the river, where we could be clearly seen by the Germans, entrenched some 1,000 meters away, and I confess I sighed in relief, for it is difficult to accustom one's self immediately to the possibility of receiving a bullet in one's head or a shell in one's stomach. We then went through the town, everywhere being told stories of how, on such and such a day last week, 5 men were killed there, and 3 wounded here, and so on. All the houses are left open, and one can walk into any doorway that looks interesting and do a tour of inspection. We left Pont-à-Mousson and started up the hill to our first Place de Secours. X. You will see it on your map some 3 kilometers from Pont-à-Mousson. Roeder, as we sped on, carefully explained that I was never to drive along this particular road, but was to take a back way, as the commandant had forbidden anyone to use this route, which was in full view of the German artillery and trenches. If he could have realized how I felt, he would have taken me by the back way that time, too. On the other side of the hill, on our right, extended the famous Bois le Pretre, but it is no longer a wood. It is just a wilderness with a few brown stumps sticking up. "Would you like to go into the Bois?" I was asked. I felt I had been in as much danger as I was likely to get into, so I said yes, and we turned to the left and mounted a steep hill and entered it. Here the birds were singing, and all was green and beautiful. It was a part where the artillery had not been, but one could see trench after trench deserted. Here was an officers' cemetery, a terribly sad sight, 600 officers' graves. Close by were also the graves of 1,800 soldiers. The little cemetery was quite impressive on the side of this lovely green hill, with the great trees all around, and the little plain wood crosses at each grave. As we waited, a broken-down horse appeared with a cartload of what looked like old clothes. Les morts. I had never seen a dead body until that moment. It was a horrible awakening. 8 stiff, semi-detached, armless, trunkless, headless bodies, all men like ourselves with people loving them, somewhere, all gone this way because of what? I don't know, do you? A grave had been dug 2 meters deep, large enough to hold 16, and then we were asked to group ourselves around the car to be taken pour souvenir. I managed to do it. I stood there by those dead men and tried to look as if it were a natural thing to do. I felt like being sick. Then one by one they were lowered into the grave, and when they were all laid out, the identification started to take place. The good boots were taken off, and if a coat was not too bloody or torn, it was kept. "Surely we must be going," I said. "No, no, not before we have shown you the dead in the fosse there." "Good God!" I cried, "I can't do that now." And I did not. We returned to Pont-à-Mousson for lunch at 12 o'clock, and I felt a very different person, and wondered how I could have felt faint the week before on merely seeing the photographs of wounded in our Neuilly hospital. One becomes habitué, they tell me. I was then officially handed over the car I am to drive, and I began looking over all the parts, as we have to do everything for ourselves here. Saturday. It hardly seems possible that we are so close to the German trenches. Fair food, even hot water, wonderful moonlight nights, and a comfortable bed. Every other night we have to sleep in barracks to be on duty any moment, and so we sleep on straw and don't undress. Every fourth night we are on duty all night and go to X and stay there in the car taking wounded to the 1st, 2nd and 3rd base hospitals. Thursday was my baptism of fire, for we had a great artillery duel, and it was very interesting, though not at all quieting, to hear the big guns fired and shells exploded over our heads. About 6 o'clock it stopped and we went in to dinner. Afterward another boy, Barclay, went for a walk with me, and we stopped to talk to 2 peasant girls who still remained in the town. "Come in and have some strawberries," they invited. And the way these girls offered us all the little luxuries their house could afford showed us how respected the American ambulance is by the peasants as well as the officers. "Do you fence?" one of them asked. "Yes, a little," I answered, and foils were brought out and we started in. The girl fenced well, but I managed to remember a little of what I once knew, when suddenly I heard a man's voice say in French, "Well done, well done! Give me the foils, my daughter, quick!" And I was introduced to a fine old soldier who had fought in the campaign of 1870. We saluted and started again, but here I soon realized the touch of a master, and although I got in a few hits, I was easily beaten and felt a little downcast. "But my husband is a professor of fencing for 40 years," observed Madame. I retired to bed, feeling that though beaten, I might have many happy games in the evening at fencing with the vieux maître. Yesterday I took out my ambulance alone and carried 8 wounded for the first time. I am now gradually slipping into my place, and the sense of strangeness is passing off. June 19th. To continue from where I left off, I am now on duty at the Bureau, our headquarters here. Last night, as I was finishing my supper, I was told to go to F to fetch a contagious case and take it to the train. Sunday. I was suddenly interrupted by being called to fetch the wounded from X, and I am just back. My roommate offered to come with me and get the contagious case, which proved fortunately to be only measles, and we started off on what I thought then one of the most amazing trips of my life. Turning suddenly to the left from the main road, I drove our little Ford 3 kilometers along the road which was in full view of the Germans, and which had been the death place of many passers-by. Then, turning left again, we drove slowly to a village so full of soldiers that it seemed impossible so many could even find shelter. A quick turn to the right, up, 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 first speed, along a very narrow road with just room for the car. On both sides were stuck up cut tree branches to make the Germans think there was no road. Up we went through another tiny hill village full of artillery, and on every side underground dugouts where they all live, trees blown down, branches stuck here and there to look like trees, and at last we reached the top. The water in the radiator was boiling, so we stopped, walked a bit in the most beautiful woods, and picked flowers and wild strawberries to the tune of birds and distant cannon. In this wood are heavy naval guns, but from where and how they were ever taken there is a puzzle. On we went through more woods until we were stopped by a sentry, who directed us still further, and then I saw what was the most dreamlike spectacle I ever beheld. The thick woods teemed with soldiers, and dotted through the forests were little huts, very low, where they live, thousands of them, pathways starting every 20 yards to some new wood village. We heard music, and on reaching our destination were invited to inspect these quaint habitations. We walked down a path past hut after hut, and then suddenly the wood opened out and we came to a kind of amphitheatre, and my friend and I were conducted to fauteuils, so to speak, and we listened, after much handshaking and "Vive l'Amérique," "Vive l'Angleterre," and "Camarades," etc., to a band of 3, banjo, violin, and dulcimer. As I write, a shell has just exploded near by. I jumped to see where, about 200 yards away, and the smoke is slowly clearing. We soon left our friends and took our contagious case to the station. After passing through wonderful valleys, hills, woods, and plains, we returned home pretty tired, wondering how such atrocities could be taking place in such a perfect country. We go regularly to X to get our blessés, and for 2 out of the 6 kilometers we are exposed to German view, and the whole of the way, of course, to shell fire. On my first arrival at this little mountain village, I was horrified to see 2 people lying dead in the road in huge pools of blood. 6 German 150's had been suddenly launched into the village, which is full of soldiers, and killed 6 soldiers and wounded some 30. 3 of the 6 shots had landed actually in the road itself. 2 of our ambulances were in the street at the time, and only chance spared them. I asked where the shells had struck, and my stretcher-bearer looked round for a moment and then pointed under my own car, and there was a hole some 9 inches deep and 2 feet wide. It made me feel rather rotten, I must say. Only 5 minutes before, and it might happen again at any moment. I took down 3 couchés, as the lying down ones are called, and had to pass in front of a battery of 75, which fired as I passed, and gave me a shaky knee feeling, I can tell you. Then backward and forward for 2 hours carrying more wounded, and to add to the excitement it rained so hard that I was thankful I had bought myself 2 uniforms and could change. Today is Sunday, and after a rather uncomfortable night in my clothes and a snatchy sleep, I have a day off. Salisbury, our section leader, asked me to go with him to Toul, and I went for what proved to be a wonderful drive through sleeping villages and semi-tilled land and woods and valleys. Toul is one of the most fortified towns in France, and as we approached we saw trench after trench and wire entanglements and so forth. The Germans, however, will never advance so far, I think. We stopped at the aeroplane sheds, where we picked up a captain, Australian, and with him entered Toul, a quiet sleeping town with a lovely church. Returning, we were taken over the sheds and saw a large quantity of biplanes and monoplanes. I am now waiting to be taken up into the trenches, but the bombardment I spoke of earlier has continued so heavily that I doubt if we shall get up to them after all. The whole section here does real work night and day amidst great hardships and no small danger, and the French appreciation is very apparent. German prisoners say that the Germans intend utterly demolishing Pont-à-Mousson if they have to retire any more, but it would take about 250,000 shells to do it, and I doubt if it is worth their while. If anyone can imagine the feeling of a peaceful man who suddenly hears a gun fired and a shell whistling overhead, followed by the explosion, and then vice versa by the enemy, he will perhaps sympathize with the disagreeable sensation I experienced when I first heard it happen. However, for 5 days it has gone on constantly, and soon I shall become accustomed. Monday. This very long letter will probably end in being so dull that it will not be worth reading, but when everything is fresh to me it is easy to describe. After 3 or 6 weeks I shall probably write that I have no news, for one day is doubtless a repetition of the other, therefore while my impressions are new I must scribble them down. I did not get to the trenches last night, as the bombardment became so bad it would have been foolish to take so great a risk sightseeing. If we had had to go to get wounded, it would have been different. I stood in the road opposite the little house I live in, and watched the Germans bombard X. It was rather like a stage scene or a colored picture show. X is a little valley town with the conventional church steeple, and about 2½ kilometers, as the crow flies, from Pont-à-Mousson. Shrapnel, curiously enough, is not considered very dangerous, and the soldiers here treat it with contempt. The Germans use it to keep people from going on to the streets to put out fires which may have been started by their 210's or 150 high explosives. Late yesterday afternoon they set fire to a haystack, and the smoke made them think that the village was on fire. So they sent about 100 shrapnel one after the other over it, and it was most interesting to see the flash in the sky, then a white cotton wool effect, and finally the sound of explosion. The French behind A immediately opened fire, and the music began. It lasted about an hour, but as none of our men were wounded, we did not have to go up there. After dinner 3 of us went for a little walk along the Moselle. One can see the Germans about 1,000 meters away on the hills, and as you walk along the banks of the river they can see you distinctly, but they don't bother to fire, which is kind of them. We sat down and watched 2 soldiers fishing, and I took a photo of them, as I thought it so amusing for people to fish under the direct and easy rifle shot of the Boche. We then went and talked to a lot of soldiers about to return to the trenches. They are all nice to us, and it would make an American proud if he could see how the American boys here are respected and loved. One officer was very indignant because those dirty Boches had actually thrown 5 shells into his trench yesterday. As he wandered off muttering, "I will show them, les cochons, les cochons, cochons," rather sleepily I thought, I couldn't help remembering the Dormouse in Alice in Wonderland. It appeared that at the particular line of trenches where he was they had agreed only to fire at each other with rifles. In several places here the trenches are only 15 or 20 meters apart, and the French and Germans are on quite good terms. They exchange tobacco for wine and paper for cigarettes, and then return and shoot at each other quite merrily. About Christmas or February, I am told, by soldiers who were then there, they used to walk into each other's trenches and exchange stories and so forth, but now they have become méchants. I am feeling pretty sick to-day, and rather dread to-night, as I have all-night duty at X. I am not at all well. It is the hard food we are having, I suppose. Anyhow, I find myself nice and thin again, so your shocking example of gaining weight last spring is now of no influence. Doc comes to-morrow, and I will give him this letter to post, as it would never get through unless posted in Paris. I have just returned from Belleville, where I took 3 couchés and 2 assises. One of the couchés was raving, and he yelled and shrieked the whole 17 kilometers. It was horrible. When I arrived at Belleville, where they are put on a train and sent to a base hospital, I found that in his agony he had torn off his clothes and broken the hangers of the stretcher, so it was a wonder he did not completely fall on the 2 men below. Our cars are packed like this. Diagram follows. I do not know what could be worse than having a poor peaceful peasant who, forced to fight and after perhaps months of agonizing trench life, badly wounded, shrieks with pain and misery as you try to avoid the many bad bumps in the road. We expect a big attack to-day, and we have evacuated all the ex-hospitals. It looks, too, as if they were preparing for many wounded. Any kind of news will be greatly appreciated. If you do not hear very regularly from me, remember it will be because work is too heavy. Thursday. Doc has not yet arrived. He was expected Tuesday, so I am afraid you won't have heard from me this week, as he will miss the mail. I am sitting at the window of my bedroom, with the sun streaming through on the table, and can imagine myself at Beauport or the bungalow, but every 3 or 4 minutes, boom, and then bang, boom, the Germans firing on Montauville and the French replying. As I sit here I can see the smoke rising from the village, and I wonder if either of our ambulances, which are on duty there, have been hurt. Doc may come to-night, and if he does so I will make him come to X to-morrow, as it is my day's duty there, and he will have some excitement. On my right I can see, about 1,000 meters away, the German trenches. It is strange to sit at a window and be in such a position, and yet be writing a letter as though we were all together again in Gloucester. I have been very sick, but to-day I am better again, and am very grateful for my recovery. Yesterday I discovered that the main backspring of my car was broken, and I had to replace it. Imagine me on my back all day working like a madman to get the job done in time for duty last night. I managed it all right, however, and so feel myself quite a mechanic. My old bus has a horrid habit of running forward when I crank it. I think I have more dread of cranking my car than of a German obus. Last night I went into the square to see the civilians leave. There are not a great many left, but the women are a nuisance, morally, and so the Governor is turning them out as quickly as he can. Alas, that they could not have done their part better! It was a sad sight, many, many tears, and some hysterics. The Governor, a splendid old colonel, came up and talked with us (there were 4 of us), and was eager to hear when America was to join the Allies. He quite spoils us all, and anything we want he sees we have, if it is possible. Last night it was amusing to see his indignation when he learned that we were paid as ordinary poilus, a familiar term of endearment referring to the unshaven men in the trenches, a sou a day. We don't draw the pay. He gallantly declared that we should all rank as sub-lieutenants, and should be compensated as such, for he added, "You brave boys do as much as any soldier at the front, and take as much risk." I like the French gallantry and sincerity. One meets it everywhere. The officers all salute us, and the poilus all cheer, smile, and "Vive l'Amérique," etc., and I feel that the work of the section is real. I have rarely met a happier lot of fellows, and all so good-natured and generous. You never hear a hard word. All work for the good cause, and as efficiency is unity, we try to be efficient. I wish you could see this dear old garrison town, with its poplars and bridge and church, and the lazy Moselle slowly creeping along to quieter and happier places. Here and there are fallen houses, and often gaps in the walls, and torn-up trees. The house next to us has been hit, and looks like this (picture follows), with piles of stone and brick all over the road. I always try to talk with the soldiers. My French is improving, but still rotten, and I find they have become fatalists. Some of the regiments here have been filled up several times, and I hear that 35,000 French have been killed in the Bois-le-Pretre. Every day great shells or hand grenades fall into the trenches, and many a poor peasant or higher caste of Frenchman is called away. I took 3 wounded to the hospital this morning from X, after they had only been in the trenches 20 minutes, having come straight from the home base. They talked so hopelessly about their chance of life. An old chap asked me yesterday if I would like a German rifle. "Well, rather," said I. He promised he would bring it to me at 7 o'clock, unless an obus hit him. He did not come, poor fellow, but perhaps he forgot his promise. I hope so. Pont-à-Mousson, June 25th. You will not have received any mail from me this week, and I am very sorry if I have caused you any anxiety. Doc said he would be here last Tuesday, and to our surprise he has not even arrived yet. I am a little anxious about him, and so tried to send him a wire to ask if he is well. As yet I have received no answer. The 3 letters I have written could never possibly reach you from here, as we are only allowed to write little open letters or postals, so I shall wait until he comes before I send them. The last few days have been quiet, but for me full of interest and hard work. I am better, but my illness of the 3 days has pulled me down a lot, and the food is not good enough to allow me to pick up strength quickly. I have had many long talks with soldiers, and they tell me most interesting stories. One told me that he got on such friendly terms with the Germans in a trench 10 meters away that he asked them all to put their heads above the trench so as to take their photos, and I have been promised a copy. Also that they promised to tell each other when they meant to attack or blow up a trench. The mining of the trenches is the most horrible method of warfare existing, I think. There seems so little chance, in fact none. The worst implement of destruction for the trench livers is the new kind of projectile called a torpille, a sort of torpedo. It is fired from about 400 meters and is noiseless, very large, and terribly destructive. Nearly all of the poor fellows we take to the hospital have been sautés by a mine or hit by a torpille. The French have developed a projectile of the same sort, and neither side has had them more than 6 weeks. It has a kind of tail to its head (see sketch), and is shot from a sort of small gun. Of course they shoot big shells of, say, 210 or 280 into the trenches, and so marvelous is the accuracy of firing that they explode often on the floor of the trench. A shell, however, one can hear coming. The whistle is very plain, and you have perhaps 1 second or 2 to hide. The torpille gives no warning, is just as large, and therefore very deadly. Yesterday I visited the trenches. I left here at 4 o'clock in the morning and started up the hill through a little village, rather like what the French call me, Bouseville, which has been much bombarded, and then climbed up past disused trenches until we came to a sentry who directed us up to the company where a friend had promised to meet me. At last I found him, and we started for the première ligne. I felt a little nervous and anxious, as I did not care to get killed sightseeing. My friend pointed out some bushes to me, and I had not noticed what he said, when on passing within a foot of another bush I found myself looking into the muzzle of a 75 gun. For some distance every inch seemed full of great guns and little guns, all so cleverly hidden that it would seem impossible to know they were there. At last we came to a hill, and were told by a sentry that we could not pass that way, for some reason or other, perhaps the position of a battery had just been changed, and we had either to go straight back or right across a field 300 yards wide, in full view of the Germans, 350 meters away. Said my friend, "Oh, I think they are eating now. Let's risk it. They never fire while food is about." So, somewhat against human nature, I assented, and we slowly trudged across the open. I confess I was relieved when we reached the shady wood. Still mounting up, we passed hundreds and hundreds of blue-coated soldiers returning from their night vigil in the trenches, and then the noise and chatter of men and birds seemed to die away, and I could hear little else but the crack of some twig one of us walked on, or the occasional bang of a rifle. This deadly silence, it was really quite awe-inspiring, continued as we passed silent groups of soldiers sipping coffee, tea, or soup. Then we took 3 or 4 steps down, and henceforth walked in trenches. Winding, curving, zigzag we went, no trench being more than 5 meters straight. The soldiers silently smiled. One heard whispered "Américain." I saluted an officer, who smiled in return, and showed me his room. Really, it was quite comfortable. At last we came to a trench where every metre soldiers stood looking and waiting. It was the thin blue line that guards France's frontier for 400 kilometres. The Germans are not pressing or attacking this particular place at present, and so the whole trench is so wonderfully neat and so clean and so uniform and almost comfortable, one began to wonder whether it was only a side-show in some exhibition. We walked very quietly along this trench for some 2 kilometres, and I suddenly discovered that in my interest I had allowed but 45 minutes to get home if I was to be in time for duty at 7. So I made a hasty retreat and arrived back at barracks just in time. End of Part 1. Part 2 of With the American Ambulance Field Service in France, Personal Letters of a Driver at the Front, by Leslie Buswell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Monday, the 28th. Yesterday we heard from Doc, who wired to say that he would arrive at 10 o'clock Sunday night. I have just seen him, and he looked splendidly. I soon retired to my room to read the mail which he brought. Letters from you and H being the only American ones. Last night I was on duty all night at X, and it was a great strain riding backward and forward in pitch darkness up and down the very steep and narrow road. I had to go to Auberge Saint-Pierre at about 2 o'clock this morning. This road is in full view of the Germans and much bombarded, and shrapnel burst close by, which reminded me that a lovely moonlight night with trees and hills and valleys dimly shaping themselves can be other than romantic. It was a sad trip for me. A boy about 19 had been hit in the chest, and half his side had gone. "Très pressé," they told me, and as we lifted him into the car, by a little brick house which was a mass of shell holes, he raised his sad, tired eyes to mine, and tried a brave smile. I went down the hill as carefully as I could and very slowly, but when I arrived at the hospital I found I had been driving a hearse and not an ambulance. It made me feel very badly, the memory of that faint smile which was to prove the last effort of some dearly loved youth. All the poor fellows look at us with the same expression of appreciation and thanks, and when they are unloaded it is a common thing to see a soldier, probably suffering the pain of the damned, make an effort to take the hand of the American helper. I tell you, tears are pretty near sometimes. I send you some photos, taken by a little camera I bought, as my large one is too big. All my love to you and to those who make the memory of America so dear to me. Pont-à-Mousson, July 2nd. I have just written you a short letter, but as Doc was not here to take it and mail it from Paris, I could write nothing of interest in it. Therefore follows this long detailed one for him to post for me when he comes. Since my last to you, he returned to Paris after being here 2 days. He looks very well indeed, and amuses us by pretending he does not see any excitement here. As a matter of fact, whenever he comes, we do seem to have a lull in the fighting. Why, I don't know, but one of these days he will arrive when something exciting is going on. Up to the day before yesterday, one day seemed very much like another. Continual explosions of shells, départ et arrivée, collecting wounded, etc. But last Thursday (Doc left on Wednesday) we had 48 hours of truly hard time. I was on day service at X, a little village, as I told you, about 1½ kilos away, of one street about 200 meters long and one church. I got up there at 7:30, and after taking 2 or 3 trips with wounded to Dieulouard, was returning to lunch at 11 o'clock, when an urgent call took me to Auberge Saint-Pierre, a little poste de secours on the top of the hill past Montauville. I also wrote you about Auberge Saint-Pierre in my last letter. To get there you have to go on an uphill road within uncomfortable range of both German and French fire. On this trip, as my little car climbed along up the hill, I saw shells bursting on both sides of the road, and I do not hesitate to say that my feelings were strained as I entered the wood. When I arrived at my destination I felt a bit shaken, but the sight of some 8 wounded made me realize that the sooner I got them down to safety the better for us all. So back I went down the little winding road to the sound of shells exploding uncomfortably near. That was the day's start. Later the Germans fired 15,000 shells into the Bois-le-Pretre. The noise was terrific. Almost the whole of our first line of trenches was ploughed up, and our cars had to run all night. About 6 o'clock I went back to dinner, but no sooner had I arrived than a call took 3 of us back to X, and I had another trip with wounded. I chatted with the médecin chef, a fine-looking man, and he told me he would give me some photos. My car was standing outside his little poste de secours, and he asked me a few questions about Fords in general, while the wounded were being put into my car. On the way down, several shells fell all around the road, and I was glad to get back to the bureau. Next morning, Friday, we learned at breakfast that the Germans had sent over 100 shells into the little village of X, one street only about 300 meters long, remember, and that there was urgent need for our men there. I went up on foot with Schroeder in the afternoon (I was off duty), and learned that my friend the médecin chef had been blown to pieces by a shell which landed exactly where my car had stood the night before. The poor little village looked very sad, for although 100 210s would not utterly destroy a village, one of them makes a house look stupid after it has been hit. We had been asked to go and see the French 155s firing, and on inquiring whether it would be safe to go, a smile and an answer to the effect that shells were dropping 8 at a time all around the battery sent the 3 of us back to Pont-à-Mousson. Saturday. The bombardment going on now is terrific. I have been standing about 100 yards from my little house and looked across the valley at Montauville, Bois-le-Pretre, and watched the shells exploding by the dozens. Monday, July 5th. I was called away suddenly, an emergency, and this is the first moment I have had to myself since. I doubt if I shall ever forget the last 36 hours, they have been so full of work, apprehension, and horror. Tuesday, 5 p.m. I must write down the events of the last 3 days, for I suppose they have been the most tremendous ones I have experienced. I tried to write yesterday, but only got as far as those 3 lines, and any moment I may be called for an attack which we expect hourly. Let me see, I must go back to Sunday, the 4th of July. We had arranged a grand fête, and the Governor, the Colonel, and the Major were our guests with 3 other captains from various regiments. An elaborate meal was prepared, and all was decorated — a piano, a stage, and many flowers, and so forth. The feast was to start at 7 o'clock, and nearly every soldier in all of the regiments round here knew it was the American fête day. Suddenly, at about 2 o'clock, commenced a tremendous artillery duel. The whole earth seemed to tremble, and the noise of rifle fire almost drowned the explosions of shells. The Germans had attacked. For some days most of the French batteries had been leaving here for up north, where a large army is concentrating, and the Germans, who know everything, attacked us at the most unfortunate moment, and by so doing won back in that short attack much of the land they had lost since December, the winning of which has caused France the loss of over 40,000 men. We all rushed to our cars to be ready for the call, and about 6 o'clock every car was ordered to X, poor little village, already badly enough damaged by the bombardment of a few hours before. We worked late, and I got to bed at 3:30, having carried some 50 wounded a distance of about 10 kilometers. 10 trips, 200 kilometers. In all, we carried away over 350 crippled wrecks who 3 hours before were the pride of their nation and families. Monday, of course, was a hard day's work, for I was on X service all night, i.e., 2 cars stay always at X all night for service. I took 4 long trips in the afternoon, and about 5 o'clock managed to get an hour's sleep, and it was lucky I did. X was quiet when I got up there about 7 o'clock, and till 9 o'clock I chatted to soldiers, and then turned into the telephone office to sleep on my stretcher, fully dressed, until I should be called. At 1 o'clock I woke up to the sound of what might have been an earthquake. The Germans had attacked again, and were bombarding X. We went down into a little dugout, where we stood listening with strained faces for 35 minutes to the shouting of soldiers, the cracking of rifles, and the terrific reports of French départ and German arrivée. Literally the whole place trembled, and when a shell, probably a 210, arrived in the village, it always seemed to us, poor rats, that it had exploded in the room above us. No sooner had the attack stopped than a phone message came through: "Can an ambulance come immediately to Auberge St-Pierre?" And of course I climbed out of the cellar, wound up my car, and drove up the hill. The old car, which was in the Battle of the Marne, seemed to know it was on a pretty dangerous trip, and it went like a bird. Any unpleasant shocks of bursting shells, etc., I may have received on my way up were quickly compensated for by the greeting of the Major: "I wish to thank you and to congratulate you on the quickness and efficiency with which you and your comrades execute their orders." I took 4 more trips, and at 12 o'clock returned to X, and thought I would get a little rest. I was just talking with the phone operator when we saw a flash and an explosion in the courtyard. After picking ourselves up from the floor, where we had thrown ourselves, we hastily returned to the dugout. For 3/4 of an hour the second attack went on, and in this dugout, some 300 yards from the German trenches, the noise was terrific, and I wondered whether I was to be a corpse, a German prisoner, or still a conducteur ambulance américain. When the attack and bombardment ceased, work began, and a general call was sent to our bureau, and before long, as I descended the hill to Pont-à-Mousson with the first carload of mutilated, I passed our fellows tooting up the hill full speed. We worked until 6 o'clock, carrying down 180 or more wounded, and then the cars returned to headquarters, as I could manage the few remaining blessés. About 7 o'clock, tired out, I made a last trip to Auberge St-Pierre, and finding no wounded there, descended to the next poste de secours, Clos Bois, and asked if they had any wounded. No, none. But surely there was a couché on the stretcher there. Come and see. He is, we fear, not suitable for your ambulance. I went up and lifted the covering from his head, and all I saw was a headless trunk. "Our dearly beloved lieutenant," said one of the soldiers, and his voice was not a steady one, nor were my thoughts peaceful as I went home to café au lait and some sleep. At 4 o'clock on Tuesday I woke up with orders to evacuate the Pont-à-Mousson Hospital to Belleville. I turned in about 2 o'clock next afternoon to sleep again, pretty tired. Wednesday came the counter-attack. I must now tell you what we have authentically learned. On Sunday, July 4th, the Germans made such a successful attack at Quart en Reserve et Le Croix des Commes, positions of the Bois-le-Pretre, with petrol and gas, hand grenades, mines, torpedoes, 320s, 210s, and 155s, 105s, and 77s, that the French lost much that they had gained in the last 6 months, that they had been taken unawares, and that we must have everything ready to leave Pont-à-Mousson at a moment's notice. Next came the news that Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday attacks had been so successful for the French that they had regained all they had lost on Sunday. Wednesday was a very exciting day for me, and I had my nearest escape. We were evacuating Pont-à-Mousson Hospital for Belleville. We had not finished this on Tuesday, and I had 3 couchés and 3 assis in my car. A captain was seated next to me, wounded in the knee. As I neared Dieulouard, I heard sounds of shells exploding, and as I reached the outskirts of the town, I saw a 210 land in the railway station some 100 yards to the right of the main road. I asked the captain if he thought it better to wait till the bombardment was over, and he replied, "I must leave this to your judgment, as we are in your car." So I decided that, as the shells generally fall at regular intervals of 3, 5, or 7 minutes, the Germans are so methodical that when you know the time they are firing, you can know to the second when the next shell will arrive, I would go on. This time, however, more than one battery was shelling Dieulouard, and as I was passing a house on the road, it was hit by a shell. All was black dust and smoke, and I had perforce to pull up a minute. 2 people in the house were killed, and although my car was covered with brick dust and debris, no one was even bruised. I don't want to come any nearer, however. I carried over 40 wounded yesterday, a distance of 160 kilos, and at 9 o'clock turned in to sleep, to be waked up at 2 o'clock to go to Auberge St-Pierre. Schroeder and I both went, as they had some 14 wounded, and it was necessary to have 2 cars. It was a glorious morning, and when I got to the top of the hill all was quiet, and God's peace seemed to be everywhere. The Major was there to receive us, and so interested and appreciative is he that any one of us would do anything for him. Just as I was starting down with a full load, I found I had picked up a nail, and a puncture was the order of the day. 2 fellows ran forward, and explaining that they were chauffeurs in peace time, refused to let me work on it, and the Major made me sit on a fallen tree by the roadside and smoke a cigarette and talk to him. We are, of course, mere soldiers, but to be treated so kindly and so thoughtfully makes us feel that we must go on forever. The Major said, "You have no idea what comfort and reassurance your cars and your work give to these French soldiers." I made one more trip to Clos Bois, where they gave me some coffee, and I paid my respects to the bodies of 3 officers just killed in the trenches. I had a German wounded couché given me, and I probed out the fact that there were some 6 or 8 French waiting to be taken. "Oh, but he is seriously wounded. Take him first." When I arrived at the hospital, I watched the German prepared for operation. He had 7 bullet wounds in the shoulder, 5 still remaining, 3 in the leg, and both arms broken. I picked up his overcoat, and I noticed that the top button was pierced by a bullet, so I cut it off and kept it as a remembrance. A gruesome one, but I will always remember that in France the German went before the less wounded Frenchman. Thursday, 4 p.m. An attack is now going on, and I suppose about 7 o'clock there will be a general call to X. Sunday. My prophecy about an attack was correct. Now there is a lull again, and I have some moments to myself to write about the last 3 days. Ever since Sunday, July 4th, there has been an attack and counter-attack, and life has been real hell for those poor fellows in the first line of trenches. Every imaginable kind of instrument of destruction has been hurled on them: mines, the narrow part fits into the gun, which is a sort of mortar, radius about 400 meters, torpedoes, radius about 400 meters, 320s, 250s, 220s, down to 77s, burning petrol, chlorine, all this not in dozens, but in thousands and tons. No one can believe what it is like there. It is indescribable, and the Germans are getting the same thing, too. I suppose the French have lost over 2,500 this week in wounded and killed, and many prisoners, and this over a line of 7 kilometers. And the Germans? Many more. Day and night our section has gone backward and forward, full of wounded and dying, and we are all feeling pretty done up. Yesterday they bombarded Pont-à-Mousson and hit a church which burnt all day and killed some people, but there are not many left here now, and hardly any soldiers. Last night, as after every attack, we eagerly asked how the fight had gone. Here we had gained a trench, there we had gained 2 trenches, here we had not won or lost, but always the same remark: "But the dead and wounded!" At any rate, the Germans are held, and our many reinforcements have made the position fairly safe. On Friday I again took down a German wounded, this time a German of the Kaiser's or Crown Prince's bodyguard. The German Crown Prince is against us here. He was dying. Picture to yourself a fine, truly magnificent man, over 6 feet 4, wonderful strength, with a hole through both lungs. He could not speak, and when I got to the hospital I asked in German if he wanted anything. He just looked at me and then chokingly murmured, "Catholic." I asked a soldier to fetch the priest, and then 2 brancardiers, stretcher-bearers, and the doctor, and the priest and I knelt down as he was given extreme unction. This is a little picture I shall never forget. All race hatred was forgotten. Romanist and Anglican, we were in that hour just all Catholics, and a French priest was officiating for a dying German, a Boche, the race that has made Europe a living hell. I came back about 7 o'clock at night to the hospital with more wounded, and asked if he still lived. Yes, would I care to see him? I went in, and although he breathed his last within an hour after, his look showed recognition, and that man died, I am sure, with no hatred for France. I could tell you a multitude of stories so horrible I cannot forget, so pathetic that tears are not rarely in my eyes. On Friday night I was on Montauville duty, and a new regiment arrived. "Bon camarade," to me at once. "How many wounded, etc.?" they asked. I could not tell them that they were going to a place where between their trench and the German trench were hundreds of mangled forms, once their fellow citizens, arms, legs, heads scattered disjointedly everywhere, and where all night and all day every fiendish implement of murder falls by the hundred, into their trenches or onto those ghastly forms, some half rotted, some newly dead, some still warm, some semi-alive, stranded between foe and friend, and hurls them yards into the air to fall again with a splash of dust, as a rock falls into a lake. All this is not exaggerated. It is the hideous truth which thousands of men here have to witness day and night. Saturday night they came back, some of those poor fellows I spoke a cheery word to on Friday. No arms, no hands, no feet, one leg, no face, no eye. One glorious fellow I took had his hand off, and although it was a long trying drive to Dieulouard, he never uttered a word. I touched his forehead when I arrived and whispered, "Bon courage, mon brave." He looked at me a moment and answered, "Would God he had taken my life, my friend." Today I went to take 3 wounded officers to Toul, some 30 kilometers away, and before starting I went into the hospital to see if I could do anything for any of those butchered by civilization. I saw a friend, the man who had offered me a German bayonet. He beckoned me with his eyes, and then, "Have they forgotten me? I have been here for 5 hours, and both my legs are shattered." It was true that every bed was full of wounded waiting to be dressed, but I went straight up to the médecin chef and told him that a friend was over there with both legs broken, and could he be attended to. "Ah, we have been looking after the others first, as he must die, but I will do what I can." I stood there and watched his 2 legs put into a position that looked human, and then I bade adieu to a new found friend. I think I am glad he will die. I would prefer to die than to be crippled for life, and if my turn comes, I only hope I may not recover to be helpless. It is no good trying to make you understand what horror really is. You must see a bit of it as we see it here to be able to semi-realize what that place, the Bois-le-Pretre, is like. It was known by the Germans when held by them as Hexenkessel, Witch's Cauldron, and as Wittenwalde, Widow's Wood. I wish you would cut out and keep for me anything mentioned in the official reports about the Bois-le-Pretre, Pont-à-Mousson, Cat en Reserve, probably the most mutilated, unthinkable place in the world, La Croix des Carmes, etc. Monday. I have just received the mail with lots of nice letters. It was so jolly hearing from you all. I am glad to tell you that this section is to be mentioned by order of the Army, and it will probably receive the Croix de Guerre, which our section commander will wear, of course. We may all get some sort of medal some time as well, perhaps. If my letter seems too horrible, just don't send it on to the friends who might otherwise care to hear. My only object in writing so fully is that I do want you all to realize the futility, the utter damnable wickedness and butchery of this war. P.S. The Governor of the Department of Lorraine sent from Nancy the following tribute. On this day, when you celebrate your national independence, at the same hour that France in violent combat defends her independence against an enemy whose madness for domination threatens the liberty of all nations, and whose barbarous methods menace civilization, I address to you the expression of the profound friendship of the French for your great and generous nation, and take this occasion to offer new assurance of the intense gratitude of the population of Lorraine for the admirable devotion of all the members of the American Ambulance of Pont-à-Mousson. Pont-à-Mousson, July 16th. It so happened that a wounded officer was going to Paris, and he posted the letters of July 2nd to you for me, and therefore you got them 2 weeks earlier. Now Doc has suddenly returned on his way to Peigny, and I am writing about the last few days. They have been full of misery, and yet full of pleasure. The 14th of July, the day of the fall of the Bastille, was to be a fête day for France as usual, but I little thought I should spend such a wonderful day myself. Schroeder and I were invited to pay a visit to the batteries above one of our postes de secours, and as we were both off duty, about 3 o'clock we went up to B in one of our service cars, and thence walked to see our friends. If anyone doubts what grateful friends and how appreciative the soldiers are for our little help here, they should have seen the welcome we were given. We were shown the 75's, the 220's, the 155's, and you must realize by that how completely we foreigners are trusted, for could the Germans but know where these guns are, few of our friends would live to see France win the war. Next we were shown all over the abris, little dugouts about 10 to 14 feet underground and covered with 3 or 4 layers of good-sized trunks, like this diagram. These they retire to when the Boches bombard the wood. All along the paths leading from one big gun to another were shells, 200 or 300 great things about 3 feet 8 inches high. We then went and had some beer with our friends, all non-commissioned officers, and about 4 o'clock a corporal came to say that the 155s were going to fire 4 rounds, and would we care to go and watch, as the officer invited us. Of course we followed our guide to the gun, and they all posed while I took a photo. Then the officer asked me if I would care to photo the gun being fired, and I said yes. I stood some 10 meters away and had just pressed the button of the camera when I jumped half out of my skin at the noise of the explosion. I shall anxiously look for the negatives, and I hope they will be good. It was now 5 o'clock, and we had to return to Pont-à-Mousson. Would we stay to dinner, the 14th July? What? Spend France's fête day with France's artillery in a wood some 2 kilos from the Germans, surrounded by the guns that were fighting for her liberty? It sounded too good. Of course we accepted. So 5 of us, 3 French artillerymen and Schroeder and I, walked down to get to B on the road our ambulances travel all day long. We were all in one line across the road when, without warning, bang! 30 meters away, earth was thrown yards into the air. The noise was terrific, and then the black, dense smoke began almost lazily to fade away. We all 5 stood still, semi-crouching, although inwardly knowing that all precautions were then futile, that if we were to be killed by the éclat of that explosion we would not escape. It was too late. After 5 or 10 seconds we breathed again, and I looked at my companions. 3 of them had been firing heavy shells for 11 months, but their sunburnt faces had assumed the most haggard, pale expression I have ever seen. I had no looking-glass, but I expect if Schroeder writes his experience to his people, he will include my face as being like the rest. Had we been 20 yards further on, or 30 yards farther back, fini! The éclat of a German shell always go like this. Diagram. But the French like this. Diagram. The strain made me give a little laugh, which froze pretty quickly on my lips, for I was silenced with a look. Attends! Listen for the next départ. 10 anxious ears listened, but it was just a chance German shell, and no more arrived. When we returned to go to dinner about an hour and a half later, I asked them to help me to find the fuse, and there it was, still hot. I shall keep it in memory of July 14th, 1915. We sat down in that little wooden shelter, about 16 of us, and I cannot tell you what a happy party we were. Laughter and song fêting the 2 honored guests, the Américains. The captain heard we were dining with his non-commissioned officers, and sent up 3 bottles of white wine to drink the health of the Allies. We had brought some Moselle as a present to our hosts, and when the others were finished, our bottles were a great surprise. They were quickly emptied, a candle was stuck in each, and we started singing and telling stories. Then, as an act of courtesy, I was asked to sing our national anthem. I got up, a bottle of wine was fetched to fill our glasses, and did so as loud and as heartily as I knew how. It must have been a strange sight for the casually passing French soldiers to see their 16 compatriots standing silently, listening to a man sing a song that they scarcely knew, though one which means so much to so many thousands of our countrymen. I had but finished when bang, 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 bang! 4 75s were fired over our heads, going to kill those who should sing another national anthem. The Marseillaise followed, and I have never heard it sung in surroundings more fitting or more impressive. Then an artillery duel started, and backward and forward above us went and whistled the shells. 5 of our friends suddenly left us, and in 3 minutes we heard the big 220 firing its death gift into the German trenches. All the time the songs continued, and those woods must have echoed and re-echoed with the strains of the Marseillaise, etc. Schroeder and I, however, began to get anxious, for the noise of the artillery increased and increased, and we knew that in about 2 hours all the ambulances would be needed at X. So we bade our friends good-bye and arrived home to find that only half of our cars would be required. We then turned into bed with the conviction that we had really experienced the true feeling of France on the anniversary of the great step toward which she believed would be for the freedom of the people. Doc had arrived unexpectedly from Paris, and your letters were very welcome, also one from Mother and Mrs. A. It was the very night, 14th of July, that you were giving your lecture. I am sure it was a success. End of Part 2. Part 3 of With the American Ambulance Field Service in France, Personal Letters of a Driver at the Front, by Leslie Buswell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 3. July 15th. Doc and I spent the day together. It was my duty day at Montauville, and although it poured, I enjoyed it very much. All we did and saw I shall leave to him to tell you about. So good night. God bless you all. Pont-à-Mousson, July 24, 1915. When I last wrote you, I little thought my next letter would follow such a tragedy as occurred on Thursday the 22nd. It is now 2 days ago, so in the comparative calm of perspective I must try to tell you the whole story from beginning to end. Thursday morning, Schroeder and I went to visit the hospital on the other side of the Moselle, and there we were received by the Sister Superior, who personally showed us all over the building. The corridors are now used as wards, as every room but one in the large old convent has been hit by a shell. We got back to lunch about 12 o'clock, and Mignot, our indefatigable friend in the position of general servant, upbraided us for our unpunctuality, etc. We had hardly finished lunch when a shell burst some 20 meters away, and we hurriedly took to the cellar, while 11 more shells exploded all around our headquarters, or caserne, as we called it. We then went for a round of inspection, and found that the 12 shells had all fallen on our side of the road, and were all within 40 or 50 meters of us. This made us feel pretty sure that the shells were meant for us, or for our motors. Schroeder and I discussed the matter, and came to the conclusion that we did not like the situation very much, and that if the Germans sent perhaps 6 shells all at once, we should many of us get caught. I was very tired, and about 1:30 went to sleep, and slept until 5:30, when I went to dinner at the caserne. The evening meal over, an argument started about the merits of a periodical called Le Mot. Do you know it? A kind of futurist paper. After a rapid-fire commentary from one and then another of us, which continued until about 8:30, Schroeder and I decided to go to our rooms to bed. We were walking home when I reminded him that he had been asked to tell 4 of our fellows who slept in a house near by to be sure that no light could be seen through the shutters. So turning back, we rapped on the window and heard merry laughter, and were greeted with a cheery invitation to join the 9 who had gathered inside. It seems one of them, who had been on duty at Montauville, had managed to get some fresh bread and butter and jam, and they were celebrating the event. We had to decline their friendly hospitality, however, as we wanted to get some sleep. I had just got my boots off when whish, bang, bang, bang! 4 huge shells burst a little way down the road toward our caserne. 30 seconds after came 2 more. 5 minutes later 6 more, and then we heard a screaming woman ejaculating hysterically, "C'est les Américains!" Schroeder and I looked at each other without speaking. We hurriedly dressed and started to run to the caserne, women and soldiers shouting to us to say where we were. But rushing on through the fog, smoke, and dust, we reached headquarters. There we found the rest of the section in the cellar, and hurriedly going over those present, realized that 2 were absent, Mignot and the mechanic of the French officer attached to us. Out we ran, shouting, "Mignot! Mignot!" From the dust and smoke there staggered someone we did not know, blood flowing from head, legs, and arms. "Au secours! Au secours!" It was the mechanic. Leaving him with the section to be dressed, we rushed madly through the fog-bound street, crying, "Mignot! Mignot!" Then suddenly, across the road, a shadow, a dark spot on the ground, 2 women quite dead, a boy dying, a man badly wounded, and farther on a still blue form. "Quick, old man! Listen! His heart!" It was he, Mignot, and dead. Our loyal and devoted servant, who was almost the living incarnation of Kipling's Gunga Din. We rushed back to get stretchers and a car. Ogilvy got his car, and we got our stretchers out to take away the blessés. There were a few of us grouped about, some 7 or 8, and a car, with the wounded just put on stretchers, when "Look out! Bang! Bang! Bang!" 3 more shells. We had already thrown ourselves on the ground, and then, finding we were still alive, feverishly loaded the car. "Good God, I've stalled it," said the driver. Then the cranking. Would it never start? Try again. Oh, thank heaven, it was off. Hardly 30 seconds after, whish, bang, bang, 2 more came. We retired to a cellar for a few minutes, as the 3 dead could stay there while it was so terribly dangerous. At last we emerged and were about to lift Mignot's body when both arms moved. Was he alive after all? No, it was only the electric wires he was lying on that had stimulated his muscles. The car turned the corner with the 3 dead, and we ran back to the caserne. There we found the rest of our section, very shaken indeed. A shell had burst just outside of the house where the 9 were making merry, and the violence of the impact had hurled all of them to the ground. 2 feet nearer and the whole lot would have been killed. Schroeder and I decided we had better go back to bed, and we insisted that Ogilvy, who lived in the house so nearly destroyed, should come with us. We made him a sort of bed on the floor and turned in. As the light went out, a strange silence crept over us 3, and I am sure that I was not the only one who was offering a silent prayer for the wife and children of our devoted friend Mignot, and of gratitude for our miraculous escape from death. I must have dozed off when I was awakened by the whole house shaking, and 6 more terrific explosions followed, and then still 6 more. Should we go out again? No, all the rest were certainly in cellars and out of danger. About 2 o'clock a tremendous attack woke us up, and for an hour the whole place shook and re-echoed with the sound of artillery, hand grenade, and rifle fire. We stayed awake expecting a call, but none came till 5 o'clock, when we were told that the médecin divisionnaire had ordered us to leave Pont-à-Mousson immediately. We dressed and packed and got around to the caserne to find that nearly every one had already left, and that all thought Ogilvy dead. Why? We asked. His house had been completely destroyed. Even a .280 shell had burst in the cellar itself. 2 shells had burst in our caserne, and all around was wreckage and mess. We got some coffee at a little café, and being on Montauville duty, went up there, a sad and depressed being. That afternoon, about 1 o'clock, a shell burst right in the middle of the street at Aix, killing 1 soldier and badly wounding 4 more. I was not far away. I took them to the hospital at Dieu-le-Roi, where I found the rest of the section getting themselves installed in their new quarters. In the evening we went, at 8 o'clock, to poor Mignot's funeral. Sad and horribly gruesome it was. Imagine a little chapel with 4 coffins in front of a small altar, one of them with many flowers, and of oak, Mignot's, the other 3 just pine wood, the ordinary war coffin. The governor came, and I shall not forget the dim scene, the priest who intoned the Latin burial service out of tune, and the choir, consisting of 1 man who sang badly and as loud as he could, and a congregation of silent mourners. Every note, every word, as it re-echoed through the chapel, seemed like the cry of despair of France, a small but pitiful note of the anguish of this country. Over at last, the coffins were shuffled out of the little chapel, and we were allowed to follow them to the bridge to Saint-Martin, where they were buried in a cemetery constantly upheaved by German shells. Horrible, horrible, horrible! That is all I can write. There had not yet been time to find rooms at Dieu-Lard, and I was asked if I minded sleeping in Pont-à-Mousson. "No, not a bit." So I spent last night there alone, and perhaps for the last time, in our little room, Schroeder's and mine, of which I once sent you a photo. He was at X on night duty. This morning I am sitting in that room at the window writing this. All's quiet, the sky cloudless and blue, birds are singing, the red roses in the garden blossom in the sun, and the peace of heaven is really on earth around me. Then comes the memory of Thursday night, a vision of another world. Doc will probably arrive here today, as we had to wire him at once, and so you may get this letter next mail. Pont-à-Mousson, July 26, 1915. Since Friday, things have been topsy-turvy. Our section leader was away en repos, and Glover, who is in charge in his absence, naturally feeling responsible for the safe-keeping of our many ambulances in this division of the Army, thought best to evacuate Pont-à-Mousson. Of course, the point of virtue in the idea was to avoid the possible loss of some of our men as well as cars, which would be a tragedy for the French wounded. But our section is here to give its best service, and I can't help feeling that it is better not to lower the standard of work and efficiency by retiring to blank. Perhaps I have rather forcibly expressed this idea, but a number of the men here are of the same opinion. I sleep at Pont-à-Mousson as usual, and of course Schroeder does too, and now 3 others also. I want to point out that the moral effect of seeing us about this place is very great on the soldiers encamped here, and if you could have heard their condolences and seen the look of pleasure on their faces when Schroeder and I walked down the street last night, you would realize that what little extra risk it involves is negligible compared to its beneficial effect. However, when Salisbury returns, we may have to leave, for good, dear old Pont-à-Mousson. I suppose you saw in the official French report of the 29th that we had been shelled. It meant something to you then, I am sure, but you little realized that it was our little group of ambulances they were hammering at. Our whole section has been cited by order of the division, and last night the official wording and so forth was sent to us. It is really a very great compliment, and I am so pleased. I expect Salisbury will get decorated as head of the section. Here is a translation of it. American Ambulance Automobile, Section AY, composed of volunteers, friends of our country, has been continually conspicuous for the enthusiasm, courage, and zeal of all its members, who, regardless of danger, have worked without rest to save our wounded, whose affection and gratitude they have gained. Poor Mignot! Life at Pont-à-Mousson will be very different without him. Our mechanic, who was wounded, is, I now hear, to have his left arm amputated. What a real tragedy the 22nd was for us. The more we think about the evening, and as further details come to light, the more we marvel that we were not all killed. It is strange, too, how those who one felt would behave well, did, and I am proud of my friends in the section. P.S. We hear that a German captain, a prisoner in Paris, said that if any American ambulance man was captured prisoner, he would be shot. Nice lot of people, aren't they? July 29, 1915. I had a very interesting day yesterday. As you will have seen by official reports, the German presented us again with some 20 to 30 big shells on Monday night, and although I was at Pont-à-Mousson, I was in a good cellar. About 3 people were killed, but 1 woman was wounded just down the road, and the doctor and I had to run out and bring her in. We were sufficiently excited not to think of more shells, and as she could run too, and did so with a vengeance, it was not a long promenade. Yesterday I went with Schroeder to lunch with the battery who had entertained us at dinner on the 14th July. They had moved their position nearer the Germans. I have rarely enjoyed a day more. The sun was glorious, the views perfect, and the woods enchanting, though shells bursting in the air took the place of birds. We had a splendid lunch, and afterwards went out and visited the numerous guns and trenches. I took many wonderful photos, c'est-à-dire they ought to be. I saw about 5 different-sized guns, and then we advanced to the trenches. Finally we reached the first line, where silence reigned supreme except for the occasional bang of a rifle or the intermittent explosion of shells. We went to an advanced post several meters in front of first line, and there, carefully looking through a hole, I saw the German trenches. I then expressed a wish to be able to photo them, and I was shown a place where I could stand up and quickly get a snapshot. I regretted having made the wish, but I saw they were looking at me, and I didn't intend showing a white liver, so up I jumped and took two. The bullets did not whistle all around me, as I suppose I ought to write, and although I was successful in taking the pictures, I do not intend to try the game again. In fact, I have now seen all the trench life I want to, and do not mean to visit them further. The point is that if I should be killed or wounded on a sightseeing expedition, it would not be very creditable, and we run quite enough risk when on duty. Strange to say, I felt far less nervous in the first-line trenches than when on service at Pont-à-Mousson or Montauville. In fact, I felt quite a sense of security in those splendidly built trenches, while in a town the shelling is so much more dangerous. And when you have to go out into it sitting on that little Ford jostling its way over the bumpy road, the sensation is not a very comfortable one. However, as I told you before, I am a fatalist now, absolutely. We made our way slowly home to Pont-à-Mousson, and there saw shells bursting over a little town in the valley, and I got a photo of it. I am tired, so good night. July 30th. All your letters from July 4th to July 15th have just arrived, and also a very nice one from Marconi. It was a great joy to me to know of your success and of your glorious effort. Things are gradually quieting down here, but we have had a dreadful time. However, I am glad the work we are doing is so well worth the cost. One has little time and less inclination, in the presence of such great tragedy, to consider the virtue of one's personal service, but somehow it is good to remember that although one has done work at the front, it was without pay, titles, etc. I acknowledge that I look forward to October, when I plan to go back for a bit. I shall have had 4 months' service at the front without a rest, and although I can, I hope, keep going another 8 or 10 weeks, I feel that without some respite the winter would finish me, if the Germans omitted to do so. I find myself feeling an intense, though futile and unphilosophic, resentment at my physical condition, the not being able to eat enough to keep always at top speed, and, of course, one can never allow even a shadow, much less a mention of one's own problems to appear. The personal equation practically doesn't exist here. August 2nd. Salisbury, who has returned to us, has supported our little group, who objected to the evacuation of Pont-à-Mousson. He found us a very fine, suitable house. An aesthete would go mad in it, German, and bad German at that, and we were told that no shell had fallen near it for 9 months, so we entered with confidence. The telephone was established, and after changing the furniture about, altering a few details, and, I confess it, bringing in a few flowers from the garden, we found ourselves almost magnificently installed. Yesterday, the 1st of August, the French violently bombarded a town where a German regiment was en repos, and when I arrived at Montauville for day duty at 7:30 yesterday morning, I was told that all the towns around here were expecting a bombardment in revenge. Needless to say, it was correct. About 10 o'clock I had a call to go to Aubert-Saint-Pierre for 2 seriously wounded, and when I arrived there the médecin-chef told me that if I got them to the hospital quickly they would have a chance of living. So No. 10 tooted off down the hill, at what the plain warrior would term a hell of a pace. As I entered Montauville I saw no one about, but as I passed a poste de secours a doctor rushed out and told me to take 2 more if I had room. I noticed they filled my car with extraordinary speed, and it was not necessary to tell me that Montauville was being bombarded. My stretchers filled, I set off again for my destination with the 4 seriously wounded. I decided to take a different road, which was quicker, though supposed to be more dangerous, and 2 big shells fell on the road I did not take while I passed. I began to think myself lucky. As I entered Pont-à-Mousson I saw no one about, a bad sign, and on turning to go to Dieulouard, where we took the wounded, I saw a huge shell explode 200 metres down the road I was to drive along. Had the ambulance been empty or with only slightly wounded, I should have waited, of course, but under the circumstances my duty was to go on as fast as I could. I noticed ahead of me 3 large motor trucks, and the thought struck me, what if those are hit and contain ammunition? I was 10 yards away when, bang! I was half blown out of my seat. A shell had landed on the motor truck. Hardly believing I was not hit, I increased my pace and emerged from the smoke and blackness going at a good clip, safe and sound, but shaken. I deposited my wounded and started to return, but was stopped and told that the road was not passable, as 30 large 210s had fallen on it, and trees were all over the place. I forgot to mention the truly gruesome part of the tale. When I arrived at Dieulouard, I noticed that everybody was pointing at my car. I supposed it was because we looked so smoke-grimed, but on arrival at the hospital several people ran out to me with curious expressions, and I then got down to discover what was troubling them. One of the poor fellows had thrown himself off the stretcher, and all of his bandages had slipped, and a trail of red was flowing from the car and leaving a pool on the ground. I got back to our bureau about 12 o'clock by a roundabout way, and had lunch, and went up about 12:30 to Montauville again. While at lunch the shells continued to fall at fairly regular intervals on the road. Suddenly those nearest the window threw themselves on the floor, an action familiar to us constantly under shell fire, and before you could sneeze the lot of us did likewise, and we heard an éclat fly over the house. Laughing, we got up. We were about 800 metres from where the shells were bursting, and I went out into the street to see where the éclat had fallen. There it was on the road, weighing about 3½ pounds. It was hot to the touch. 3½ pounds thrown 800 metres. I have kept it as a paperweight. As a little luncheon incident it is entertaining. Nothing of great interest happened during the afternoon, except that I broke my foot brake, and tomorrow must put in a new one. After dinner, being off duty, I went to bed about 8 o'clock. Schroeder left yesterday to go and see his brother who is wounded. He returns in about a week. Meanwhile I am alone and don't like it. At 1:30 o'clock this morning I woke up. Something was wrong. Bang, 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 bang. Pont-à-Mousson being bombarded, and badly. 15 shells falling in 3 minutes, I counted, and the firing continued for an hour and a half with intervals. I got dressed, prepared to descend into the cellar if the shells came too near my house, and then about 6:15 the bombardment stopped. I left the house to find several fires started around the town. They had shelled with incendiary shells as well as high explosives. As I got back to our new headquarters, imagine my surprise to find a huge shell hole 2 yards from the house, in the drive itself. The house never bombarded for 9 months. All the fellows, however, were safe, and our breakfast was a jocular one, for we could not help seeing the funny side of it all. August 3rd. Just a few more lines, as one of our section is returning to America and will take these letters over, and you should get them about August 18th with luck. I hope the lecture was a financial success besides a personal one. If all those people in America only knew what this section and our work mean to the soldiers here, money would not be long in coming. No one can realize what our little group does for the mutilated wounded, but if anyone doubts it, I wish he or she could see the grateful thanks in the eyes of the wounded soldier as he is taken from our ambulance and put into a fairly comfortable bed, with doctors ready to attend him. Let him see the poor soldier, hardly able to move, insist on taking your hand, and let him hear that whispered "Merci, mon camarade," and let him talk to the soldiers newly returned from the trenches or just about to enter there. Let him hear that smiling greeting and see those hands waving "Bonjour, camarade." Let him hear what the officers say. Then, if he has had any doubts, he could have them no longer. I don't claim that I personally am doing anything, but I do say that this section of 25 men has done more to cement the love for America with the troops around here than any possible action the USA could take in this war. And I believe that the same fact is true of our service in the North and South fronts. Everyone should realize this, and I hope that any of my friends to whom you read this letter will bear our field service in mind if they hear of anyone wishing to be truly philanthropic. The hospital itself cannot go on indefinitely supporting us, as they are very short of funds and have a great undertaking on hand to feed and keep up the Neuilly and Juilly hospitals. Doc tells me they must get 2 million francs to keep things going till next spring. Only a small portion of that money, of course, could come to our field service, so your effort is for a great purpose. I must tell you what happened to the wounded before our little cars came here. We carried over 1,800 last week, and more than 7,500 during July. They were picked up in the trenches, Bois-le-Pretre, etc., when they could be got at, sometimes, if lucky, an hour after, and sometimes 5 or 6 hours, or never. The brancardiers, chiefly artists before the war, do this work, a terrible job and very, very dangerous, as the wounded are often between the German and French trenches, and they have to creep out at night and drag them in. Well, these wounded are carried on brancards, stretchers, down the hill from the trenches, probably a journey of some 30 minutes to the Refuge des Blessés, still in the wood, and there a primitive dressing to stop bleeding is put on. Then they are jostled on, till they arrive at one of the postes de secours where our light little cars can go. These are the Auberge Saint-Pierre, Clos-Bois, and Montauville. Here, in former days, they were redressed, and if there were room, stayed in the little shelter, or if not, they had to lie outside till a horse wagon came to fetch them. Sometimes they would have to wait many hours before their turn came, and even the most urgent cases would not get away and arrive at the hospital for a long time. Hundreds of soldiers died thus. Now, with our little cars, an urgent case is at the hospital ready for operation in 20 minutes at the most, and generally about 10 to 15, no matter what time of the day or night. That is why these soldiers around here are so grateful. I have seen cars go up to Auberge Saint-Pierre to fetch an urgent case when the driver knew the road was being shelled, and the soldiers who see our cars tooting up the hill wonder and say, "Volontaire?" I have got a call, and so must stop, for before I could get back, the friend who is to take this letter would doubtless have had to leave. 1½ hours later. I still have a few minutes, so I will continue. As you know, I almost never reread what I write, but I have run over this letter, and although every word I say is accurate and unexaggerated, I don't want you to imagine that the French Red Cross is not efficient, but they cannot afford cars everywhere with drivers and so forth. That is why our section here is so useful. The horror of the whole war is growing on me day by day, and sometimes when I have got into my bed or am trying to get a few hours' sleep on a stretcher — every other night I am on duty and so cannot undress — the horrors of blood, broken arms, mutilated trunks, and ripped open faces, etc., haunt me, and I feel I can hardly go through another day of it. But all that is soon forgotten when a call comes and you see those bandaged soldiers waiting to be taken to a hospital. I almost love my old car. It was in the Battle of the Marne, and I often find myself talking to it as I pick my way in pitch darkness, past carriage guns or reinforcements. If one does not quickly become an expert driver, one would have no car to drive, for it is almost impossible to see 5 yards ahead, and it is at night that the roads are full of horse carts and soldiers. End of Part 3.